everybody, welcome to my new kitchen where today we are going to be making donuts with a recipe that's over 100 years old. Now, I got some comments like this. It seems that y'all really like learning about Klein Creek Farm and when I go over there to volunteer.
They always come out delicious.
So I thought maybe I would answer some questions as we make the donuts today so that you can learn more about what I do when I'm over living in the fake 1890s. One of the questions asked was what was the hardest part about cooking with that stove? And the big thing is it just takes a really long time. But once you've got that fire going, then it just takes a really long time to get anything cooked. If I were cooking on a wood burning stove today instead of the gas stove that I'm using, then I would most likely be melting down the lard before I even get started making the dough, because it would take probably an hour or so to get up to the correct boiling point. But because I am using a gas stove, then I don't have to worry about that, and so we're not going to even start the stove until after the dough has rested for a little bit. And instead, I'm just gonna jump right into making the dough. To get into the spirit of things, we are going to be using the exact same recipe that we use on the farm, and that is from the Boston Cooking School Cookbook by Fannie Farmer from 1896. And you will need 1 cup of sugar, 2.5 tablespoons of butter, 2 eggs, 1 cup of milk, 3.5 teaspoons of baking powder, 1/4 each of a teaspoon of cinnamon and grated nutmeg, but honestly, I put in a way more than that, and 1.5 teaspoons of salt. It just says flour to roll in the original recipe, but really, once you get into the recipe itself, it actually says that you should add 3 1/2 cups flour mixed and sifted with all of the rest of the dry ingredients, and then you should add even more flour for rolling. So altogether, you're probably looking at between 5 and 5.5 cups of flour if you include all of the flour that you need to roll out the dough. So the recipe says this: cream the butter and add 1/2 sugar. Beat egg until light, add remaining sugar, and combine mixtures. Add 3 1/2 cups flour, mixed and sifted with baking powder, salt, and spices, then enough more flour to make dough stiff enough to roll. Toss 1/3 of mixture on floured board, knead lightly, pat, and roll out to 1/4 inch thickness. Shape with a donut cutter, fry in deep fat, take up on a skewer, and drain onto brown paper. Add trimmings to 1/2 remaining mixture, roll, shape, and fry as before, repeat. Donuts should come quickly on top of fat, brown on one side, and then be turned to brown on the other. Avoid turning more than once. The fat must be kept in a uniform temperature. If too cold, donuts will absorb the fat. If too hot, donuts will brown before sufficiently risen. See rule for testing fat. And what I did to test the fat, as you will see, is I just put in a thermometer, because this is a 21st century kitchen and I am a 21st century cook who is merely using the same recipe that came from 1896. And obviously the biggest difference between using this cooking method and using the method on the stove out there at Klein Creek Farm is that I can control pretty much every aspect of the process. So these donuts are going to be probably 1,000 times more uniform than the ones that we made at Klein Creek. They were still really tasty, and it was a lot of fun to make them, but these donuts are going to maintain the almost perfect cooking environment in order to make them, well, similar to donuts that we know today. In response to DJ K's question, how did you cook the donuts on a wood-burning stove? The answer is simple. We cooked them the same way on the wood-burning stove as I did today. The only other big factor that's different from what we did over there at the wood-burning stove is the fact that I have a thermometer constantly in the oil. They did have thermometers back then, but they were mercury-based. So for safety's sake, it's probably best not to use a thermometer from the 1890s in your cookware. So you'd basically just guess at the correct point at which to put in the donuts, which is why those donut holes become very important, because then you can take those to basically test the oil and see whether or not it's ready to be cooked. You can do that at home too if you don't have a candy thermometer like I do. DJK also asks, how is water obtained on the farm? And there are a couple of ways. They collect rainwater, there's also a cistern, and of course there's a well. So really, You can get water from a multitude of different ways. It's just the important thing is because it's all coming directly from the sky in most cases, then it's probably pretty important to boil it before you use it. Now just a tiny bit of history before we go on to the rest of the recipe. This is one of the easiest recipes that I've ever made on the channel. As you know, if you've been around for any amount of time, I have made another donut recipe on this channel, and you can find it in the corner up there if you are on somewhere where cards are available. You can also go to my website, oldfashionedaf.com, to see both of these different recipes. I gotta tell you, they're both delicious, so I don't think that you will have a bad time with either of them. And in both cases, they are deep fried, so believe it or not, if you wanted to make both types of donuts and then deep fry them in the exact same pot, then you could absolutely spend an entire afternoon doing that, and you will not be sad afterward. Now, in terms of the recipe itself, you heard what you had to do and kind of saw what I had to do here, but essentially what ended up happening is that you mix all the dry goods together, you mix all of the wet stuff together, and it specifies that you mix 1/2 of the sugar first and then the other half. And the reason for that is this is an absurdly small amount of butter for the amount of sugar that you need to cream together. And even though we have a mixer that I could absolutely use for this recipe, it's not really worth it to do that because first off, it's really unlikely that you would have had one of those in the 1890s to begin with. So I thought, in the spirit of things, why not make stuff using your hands, because it's good exercise if nothing else. But then also, the creaming of the butter is much easier when the ratio of butter to sugar is similar, at least. So creaming together that first half makes more sense, and then adding in the second half and just finishing the process is a lot easier than putting it all together at the same time. Finally, once that's happened, then you essentially just make the dough by putting the dry ingredients into the wet ingredients and being kind of light and airy with it until it comes together. The thing about this dough is that it is a very strong but easily manipulated dough. It's also very sticky. So you're going to use a lot more flour than you think you need to for this recipe. But don't be afraid to add as much as you need in order to be able to actually work the dough. Because I was definitely concerned the first time that I made this recipe that it was not gonna work out because there was just so much flour added to it. But they still end up popping up and springing up no matter how much you work them, as long as you don't go so overboard that it's not sticky at all anymore. So once it gets to the consistency of a workable dough, then that's when you stop with the flour and you roll it out. Now, in order to get the shape of the donut without a donut cutter, then what I generally do is I will take a mug, the flattest one that I can find, and one of the parts of the tips of my piping bag. It just happens to have the perfect little tip on it to make that donut hole that we find so iconic. And so I cut out the holes and the donuts, and then you basically just take the rest of the dough, lay it out again. I don't even have to use a roller for this because this dough is that magical that once you add the amount of flour that you need to, then it basically just does the rest of the work on its own. And you just press it out and then make the donuts, and you can even shape them in 2 different shapes if you like. You don't have to use the donut cutter or the mug like I do. You can literally cut strips, or you can make little circular designs, and they will hold their shape as long as you stick them together properly before you put them into the oil. So once the oil is ready, and in this case we're using lard today, which is what the book recommends, and it's also what would have been standard for an 1890s kitchen, then you will essentially just drop them in carefully one by one. I like to use my spoon to drop them in as opposed to my hands because I don't want to get the oil on my hands because it's very hot and it hurts when the oil touches your skin. So don't do that, use your spoon instead. And then after a couple of minutes, flip it over. It should be golden brown, and then another couple of minutes and it can be drained. In the recipe it says to use brown paper. We're just using paper towels because it still does the same thing. You could also use a thin dishcloth, and if it's made of linen or cotton, it should be easy to drain on as well. Once the donuts are drained and cool enough to touch, then you can enjoy them. They also freeze beautifully, so I would recommend freezing them. And then when you get that urge for something sweet, then you can take one out of the freezer, pop it in the microwave for a few seconds, and then it should be good to go. Now they're ready. So here are the donuts. It's only half powdered sugar, but you know, it's got the hole. It's very crispy and crackly on the outside, soft and beautifully moist. Delicious. I think it was the perfect amount of nutmeg to cinnamon ratio that I put in there, which was about a half a teaspoon of each in the end. Even though the original recipe called for much less, I like my food spicy, and I don't think I was wrong on this one. If you go to my website, you'll be able to enjoy these donuts yourself. They are really, really good. I'm gonna take another bite. I just can't get over how spongy they are. It's just crazy. They pop right back up, see? So satisfying. Well, I hope that you enjoyed this episode. If you would like to find more recipes, then you can go to oldfashionedaf.com. That's my website, and I sometimes remix old recipes, which I do have an alternate version of this donut recipe on my blog if you want to check that out. And if you would like to become a member of the Crafty Club, you can do so at patreon.com/oldfashioned_AF. We would love to see you there, and sometimes I update you about things that are happening behind the scenes. I also send an email at least once a month that has all of my favorite vintage things and historic things from around the internet. So I hope that I will see you over there, and in the meantime, I'll see you soon for another video. Bye!